Good evening, everyone. I'm Giffen Moffin. I'm a member of the English department faculty here at Hendrix. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this year's Murphy visiting poet, Carolyn Forché. Before I begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Hendrix-Murphy Foundation for generously supporting tonight's reading. Thanks also to Henrietta Vanneman, Hope Coulter, and Sarah Angular-Young, who impress me perpetually with their organizational acumen and joyful grace. I'm grateful to all of you, too, for joining us this evening, for taking the time to be in the presence of poetry. And while we're talking about being in the presence of poetry, I'll also remind you to take a moment to turn off your cell phones. A question and answer period will follow the reading, and I hope you'll stay for the reception afterwards. Carolyn will be available to sign books at that time. And here comes the famous train. A few years after I graduated from college, I had the privilege of joining Carolyn's workshop at the New York State Summer Writers Institute. My understanding of what a poem could be and what a poem could do was narrow. I hadn't yet realized that writing poems involves us in human relationships. It hadn't yet occurred to me that poems need to communicate with their readers. On the first day of our workshop, Carolyn asked each of us to read a poem we had submitted. Sensing our collective nervousness, she asked us to do this spontaneously, without looking at one another. We listened into the silence, and one by one began to read. A fragmented chorus filled the room. While Carolyn is an anthologist in a literal sense, having edited Against Forgetting 20th Century Poetry of Witness and Poetry of Witness, the Tradition in English, I learned firsthand that she is also an anthologist in the classroom, gathering voices and spirits and making them family. She demanded that we learn from one another. Her poems demand from us the same thing. When I am reading a poem by Carolyn Forché, I find it difficult to remain still. My whole body wakes up. Within the pages of Carolyn's diverse collections, Gathering the Tribes, The Country Between Us, The Angel of History, and Blue Hour, the world becomes a living verb, capable of both great terror and great tenderness. As I read, I must become new because her words make the world new. This world is an expansive one, including within it grandmothers and sons, lovers and friends, tiny Ellie at the edge of her bed, peeling her skin from her arm as if it were an opera glove. This world includes those who remain with us even when they have no names, the fly fisher whipping the lakes, a woman pulling lilacs to herself, a child playing with its dead telephone, pears and a white towel hung in an open door occur alongside burning flesh and jeweled human sewage. I've had the pleasure of talking with many of you in this audience about Carolyn's work. You have described the quiet ferocity that emanates from her books. You have observed that these poems at once demand our attention and allow us to keep listening. We lean towards Carolyn's poems, even as they ask us to remain haunted, to borrow a phrase from On Earth. Each time we encounter Carolyn's words, the word we becomes more expansive. If these poems give us ghosts to bear, they also make us larger than ourselves. They demand that we keep alert, keep watch for the dying, growing world. We are so fortunate to have Carolyn here in person to remind us of our responsibility to live with full attentiveness. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Forché.
Thank you, Geffen. That was wonderful. Thank you for coming this evening. Thank you to the Hendrix-Murphy Foundation And congratulations to those of you who passed your mythology exam today, and to those of you who turned in your thesis yesterday. I'm really proud of you. I've had a wonderful 24 hours on your campus, which is absolutely beautiful. You must be very proud of it, and a very wonderful time with the students here, who are deeply serious and engaged and interesting and funny. So it's been very good. I'm going, because you've been studying the previous work of mine, I'm going to read a little bit from each of the previous books and then read new work. So this begins with the second book, The Country Between Us. Some of these poems arose out of experiences that I had in El Salvador between 1978 and 1980, when I was 27 to 29 years old. I was doing human rights work in a time before the 12-year civil war there, but it was a very dark time. They call it now the time of the death squads, and it was the time when a lot of people were being randomly murdered around the country. One of my experiences was to enter a prison in the countryside. It was called Ahuachapan, and this was there were political prisoners there. And I was to make an interior map of the prison so that subsequent human rights delegations could visit the prison and ask to see certain parts of it, having been prepared for that. The man that I visited, I was to pretend to have known in the past. And I call him in this poem Francisco. He had gotten married while he was in prison, legally married, but he had never spent a night with his wife. The poem is called The Visitor. In Spanish, he whispers, "There is no time left. It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another." And this one is a poem that is a documentary poem. It has an obscenity in it. I apologize. It's a 4-letter word. I am not using this word in the poem. I'm quoting someone else. I think it has 2 obscenities in it, but the Federal Communications Commission only thinks there's 1. So if I read the poem on the radio, the second time I read the poem on the radio, it got beeped, this word, so that you wouldn't hear it on the airwaves. The first time they didn't know it was coming. So I'm told I was the last person in the United States of America to use this word on the radio airwaves. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "And as for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. San Salvador, May 1978. Some of you read The Angel of History. It's a very difficult book to read. I'm sorry. I tried to explain everything today in case it's on the test. But I'm going to read a page of this because I want you to hear the voice of someone who really emerges in this book. I gave birth in Paris to my son in 1986. And I was put in the hospital a few months later for another reason, taken there in the middle of the night. It was called Hôtel Dieu, God's Hotel. That was the name of the hospital. Well, if you're a poet and you have to go to the hospital in the middle of the night, it's nice to be taken to one called God's Hotel, because you can write that in your notebook and it's possibly write about it later. It's right next to Notre Dame Cathedral. It looks a bit like a cathedral on the inside. It's ancient hospital. The poet Rilke was a patient there once. So I go up and I have a roommate, and she's about 80 or so. And she's sitting up awake, and she doesn't say good evening the way the French do. She said, "And what are you?" So I wasn't going to be intimidated by this. I said, "I'm a poet." And she said, "And I am also a poet." So she wasn't French. She said, "And I don't speak any language fluently." So I thought, either she doesn't want to talk to me at all, or I've never heard anybody say they didn't speak anything. But what she did was she didn't want to speak anyone's language anymore because she was fed up with everybody. Fed up with, the Germans because of the Holocaust, fed up with the French because of the collaboration, fed up with the Russians because of the Soviet Union. I never sort of got the idea of why she was fed up with the Americans, but she was fed up with everyone. So she talked to me for a week and kept falling asleep, waking up, talking again, 5 languages. And the story slowly came out of how she survived that Holocaust by hiding on farms, first in Germany, then in France. So I'd like to give you a little bit of how she sounded, one page of it. Her name was Ellie. She's talking. This is Isieux during the war. Isieux and the neighboring village of Bregné-Cordon. This is a farmhouse in Isieux. Itself a quiet place of stone houses over the Rhone, where between Aprils, 44 children were hidden successfully for a year in view of the mountains, until the fields were black and snow fell all night over the little plaque which does not mention that they were Jewish children hidden April to April in Isieux, near Bregné-Cordon. Comme mi vend l'écriture, comme un duvet d'oiseau sur ma vitre en hiver. In every window, a blank photograph of their internment. Within the house, the silence of God.
44 bedrolls, 44 metal cups, and the silence of God is God. In Pithiviers and Bonne-la-Rolande, in Les Milles, Les Tourelles, Moussac, and Aubonne, the silence of God is God. The children were taken to Poland. The children were taken to Auschwitz in Poland, singing, Vous n'aurez pas l'Alsace et la Lorraine, in a farmhouse still standing in Isieux. Le silence des dieux est Dieu. She goes on.
Blue Hour, with apologies to the person who wanted me to read Nocturne, I will give you a private reading of it. It's too long for this reading. I'm going to read a little piece of a very strange poem, which is 42 pages long. Aren't you glad I'm only going to read you a little piece of it? It's in alphabetical order. It's an alphabetized poem, all the way in, not just the first letter, but all the way in. And I realized that I was writing a poem in the voice of someone whose life was passing in front of them. And then I realized it might be a poem in the voice of a whole people whose lives were passing in front of them. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of the tease. The tease. Time, a severe border guard, becomes imaginary. Time lapsed in one country is only beginning in another. Time to which we are exiled. To abandon yearning for the body, to be unquiet, to be visible to oneself, to become endlessly what one has been, to cross the field without breaking the snow, to enter into yourself and to stay awake, to know not only what is, but the other of what is, to know that the great bell is the great bell, to remain haunted, to rescue the future, to say nothing without confining ourselves to silence, to search like a sheep for salt, to see or to perish, to see other than from without, to see the world as it actually is. So now we have the new poems. This book is called In the Lateness of the World. I don't know exactly when it's going to be published, probably at least a year from now. I'm going to begin with a poem about lighthouses. You probably don't have a lighthouse in Arkansas. But I really love them, and whenever I am in a place that has them, I go visit the lighthouse. There are people, lighthouse people, they just like lighthouses, and they have to go whenever there's a lighthouse. But however, there's a problem. There are a lot of these people, and they want to be alone with the lighthouse, and they don't get to be alone, so they look at each other like, when are you going to go away and leave me with my lighthouse? So this lighthouse is in Ireland, and it's called Hook Lighthouse. And there's another lighthouse across the water called Crook. It's said that Cromwell said, "We will take it by hook or by crook," meaning two lighthouses. We're going to either go one way or the other. It has a little bit of the history of lighthouses in it, but it's a poem that is not exactly about lighthouses. A night, it's called The Light Keeper. A night without ships, foghorns calling into walled cloud, and you, still alive, drawn to the light, as if it were a fire kept by monks. Darkness once crusted with stars, but now death dark as you sail inward. Through wild gorse and sea wrack, through heather and torn wool you ran, pulling me by the hand so I might see this for once in my life. The spin and spin of light, the whirring of it,
light in search of the lost, theirs since the era of fire. Era of candles and hollow wick lamps, whale oil and solid wick, colza and lard, kerosene and carbide, the signal fires lighted on this perilous coast in the Tower of Hook. You say to me, stay awake. Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass. Be the you in blossom when bees swarm. Be their amber cathedral, and even the ghosts of Cistercians will be kind to you. In a certain light, as after rain, in pearled clouds or the water beyond, seen or sensed water, sea or lake, you would stop still and gaze out for a long time. Also when fireflies opened and closed in the pines, and a star appeared, our only heaven. You taught me to live like this, that after death, it would be as it was before we were born. Nothing to be afraid. Nothing but happiness, as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light always. Be without ships. I was teaching a summer workshop at the New York State Summer Institute where I met Geffen. And another summer, much earlier, it was another workshop. And in the summer, everyone introduces themselves the first day. And since they come from all walks of life and all ages, and they're taking a summer workshop, they will say, well, I'm a practicing psychologist, and I'm just retiring, and I'd like to get back to my writing. It's been a long time, and so on and so forth. So the last person to introduce himself was a very tall 19-year-old refugee from the Ukraine. And he had 2 large hearing aids in his ears. And I learned later that he was absolutely profoundly deaf. And he stood up to introduce himself, and no one ever does that. So that was the first thing that was unusual. And he said, my name is Ilya Kaminsky. I am from Odessa, former Soviet Union. I write poetry for God. And then he sat down. No one had ever introduced themselves that way before. And I said, okay, let's open our poems. He became the poet Ilya Kaminsky, author of the great poetry book, Dancing in Odessa. He worked with me for 7 years, and I've been working with him ever since. And I took him back to Odessa. It's a beautiful sea that was built all at once by Catherine the Great on the Black Sea. And behind it are the massive wheat fields of the Russian steppe, and in front of it is this incredible sea. And we went back because that's where Ilya grew up. So I took him there. And we also went to St. Petersburg. And outside St. Petersburg, there's a little place called Tsarskie Selo. It's the summer residence of the Tsars, so it's not such a little place. But the great poet Anna Akhmatova spent her summers there when she was a girl. And the great poet Pushkin went to school there. So we visited it like it was the shrine to the poets. And this was an amazing thing. And when I was flying into Little Rock, I was sitting next to a woman. We were talking. She was a physician. She was married to a statistician. It was a wonderful conversation. Turns out she's from Odessa, and that she came here when she was 9. So I have to read this poem tonight to you. It's called For Ilya Tsarskie Selo. We stand at the casement window of Pushkin's lycée. These are the desks where Pushkin wrote, his chalkboards, his astrolabe. Snow falls from here into the past and vanishes on golden minarets. Snow recedes from the birches. A lesson writes itself in winter chalk. On the day Michelangelo died in Rome, Galileo was born in Pisa. Isaac Newton was born the year Galileo died. When they searched for the poet Kabir, they found nothing beneath his shroud but a sprig of jasmine. Man is like the statue, whispering about the marble chiseled from his mouth. You are the guardian of this statue standing in your silent world. The year Isaac Newton died, there was a barn fire during a puppet show. Kabir says all corpses go to the same place, and the world has fallen in love with a dream. This life is not the same as your other life. We are here now in one of the shrines of the silver poets. You are one of the silver. The snow is a white peacock in a Russian poem.
So the person who took me to see the Hook Lighthouse liked to travel the world, but he didn't want to spend any money on souvenirs, didn't want to have ashtrays with cities' names on them all over his house. So instead of buying souvenirs, he made a practice of finding a stone on the ground everywhere he went, choosing one. He would take it home, mount it on little prongs on a little box, and he'd label it, stone found beneath the Eiffel Tower, 1976 summer. And he put them all on a wall. He mounted them on a wall. It was a beautiful museum that he had there of his whole life with stones from all his journeys all over the world. So I looked at that and I thought it was pretty neat, and I said, do you mind if I make one of those? I would like to do this too. He said, no, everybody should have a museum. So he said, just don't pick up any stones at the Parthenon or, the Acropolis. It's against the law. But he said, you can get stones from famous buildings because all the buildings are falling apart. When you're walking next to a famous building, just keep your eyes on the ground and you'll see a little chip of the building that's fallen off. So he has the Louvre and he has all these famous buildings. So I wrote this for him. And if any of you had those little rock collections when you were young, the little white boxes with the little cubicles, okay, you could take the rock salt out and put it in your mouth, and then the teacher would catch you, all of that, right? So you'll get the names of these, because some of these were in the rock salt collection box. The Museum of Stones. These are your stones, assembled in matchbox and tin, collected from roadside, culvert, and viaduct, battlefield, threshing floor, basilica, abattoir. Stones loosened by tanks in the streets. From a city whose earliest map was drawn in ink on linen. Schoolyard stones in the hands of a corpse. Pebble from Baudelaire's Oui. Stone of the mind within us, carried from one silence to another. Stone of crumb, and cairn, schist and shale, hornblende, agate, marble, millstones, ruins of choirs and shipyards, chalk, marl, mudstone from temples and tombs. Stone from the silvery grass near the scaffold. Stone from the tunnel lined with bones. Lava of a city's entombment, stones chipped from lighthouse, cell wall, scriptorium, paving stones from the hands of those who rose against the army. Stones where the bells had fallen, where the bridges were blown. Those that had flown through windows, weighted petitions, feldspar, rose court, blue schist, Nice, and Chert. Fragments of an abbey at dusk. Sandstone toe of a Buddha mortared at Bamiyan. Stone from the hill of 3 crosses and a crypt. From a chimney where storks cried like human children. Stones newly fallen from stars. A stillness of stones, a heart. Altar and boundary stone, marker and vessel, first cast, load and hail.
bridgestones and others to pave and shut up with, stone apple, stone basil, beech berry, stone break. Concretion of the body, as blind, as cold, as deaf. All earth, a quarry. All life, a labor. Stone-faced, stone drunk with hope, that this assemblage of rubble taken together would become a shrine or holy place, an ossuary, immovable and sacred, like the stone that marked the path of the sun as it entered the human dawn. Litany in Krakow. The yes of the living, the no of the wall, the yes of the bridge, the no of the water below the bridge, the yes of wind, no of wire, the yes of bells, the no of the bolted door, the yes of air, the no of answer, the yes of swallows, the no of stone. This is a ghost poem. We were talking about ghosts this morning in class. It's called In Time of War. And actually, all of the images in this poem are from actual ghosts in actual castles and strange houses in Europe. That will keep you out of strange houses in Europe. But the real scary part of the poem is not about a ghost at all. What we really should be afraid of is a different kind of thing. So it's a little ghost poem. And so we stayed, night after night, lying awake, until the moons fell behind the blackened cypress, and bats returned to their caverns, having gorged on the night air, and all remained still until the hour of rising, when the headless woman was no longer seen near the walls, nor a ghostly drum heard, nor anyone taking the form of mist or a fiddler, and the box never opened of itself, nor were there whispers and other sounds, no rustling dress or pet ape trapped in a secret passage, but there was labored breathing and unseen hands leafing through the pages of a visitor's book. And above the ruins, a girl in white lace, and 5 or more candles floating, and someone saw a white dog bound into a nearby wood, but there were no bagpipes or smiling skull, no skeletons piled in the oubliette, and no one saw the woman carrying her own severed head, and there was, as it turned out, no yellow monkey, no blood leaking from a slit throat. But there were children standing on their own graves, and there was the distant rumble of cannon. So I have another El Salvador poem that didn't get written for 30 years. And I will read it to you. The man who was in the Colonel poem, who said to me with his eyes say nothing, his name was Leonel Gomez Vidas. Leonel Gomez Vidas died on Thanksgiving Eve, 2009, of 5 heart attacks in one night, most of them in an emergency room in San Salvador. I had just seen him the week before because I'd gone down there to commemorate the deaths of the Jesuit priests, 20th anniversary of that. And then he died, and then I went back to scatter his ashes on a volcano slope where most of the war had been fought. He was a man who really, really, really tried to keep the war from happening. So he was my mentor and guide, and he kept me alive, and he got me out alive, and he helped me to do the work, and he taught me a different way of living. So there was an incident in El Salvador. One of the things we used to do was hunt for, we had a lot of disappeared people. We had their photographs, we had descriptions. of children, of older people, all kinds of people. And we would, if there were bodies that were thrown somewhere, or someone heard about bodies on a beach or bodies somewhere else, we would go and search among the bodies to see if we could find the person we were looking for. And there was one particular search that always stayed with me, and I was never able to shake it. And I dreamed about this search all these years. And after Linnell died, I found myself writing about it. So his voice is in here. He gives me little bits of advice. And it's called The Ghost of Heaven. Sleep to sleep through 30 years of night. A child, herself with child, for whom we searched. Through here or there, amidst bones still sleeved and trousered, a spine picked clean, a paint can, a skull with hair. Night to night, child, walking toward me through burning maze, over the clean bones of those whose flesh was lifted by zopilotes into heaven. So that is how we ascend, in the clawed feet of fallen angels, to be assembled again in the workrooms of the clouds. She rose from where they found her lying not far from a water urn, leaving herself behind on the ground where they found her, holding her arms before her as if she were asleep. Blue smoke rising from corn cribs, the flap of wings, on the walls of the city streets a plague of initials. Walking through a fire-lit river to a burning house. Dead singer, sewing machine, and piece of dress. Outside a cashew tree wept blackened cashews over lamina. Outside, paper fireflies rose to the stars. Bring penicillin, if you can, you said. Surgical tape, a whetstone, mosquito repellent, but not the aerosol kind. Especially bring a syringe for sucking phlegm, a knife, wooden sticks, a clamp, and plastic bags. You will also need a bottle of cloud for anesthesia, to sleep like the flight of a crane through colorless dreams. When a leech opens your flesh, it leaves a small volcano. Always pour turpentine over your hair before going to sleep. Such experiences as these are forgotten before memory intrudes. The girl was found. Don't say this. With a man's severed head stuffed into her where a child would have been. No one knew who the man was, another of the dead, so they had not, after all, killed a pregnant girl. That sound in the brush, a settling of wind in sorghum. If they capture you, talk. Talk, please. Yes, you heard me the first time. You will be asked who you are. Eventually, we are all asked who we are. All who come into the world, all who come into the world are sent. Open your curtain of spirit. When I was a young person in college, there was the Vietnam War, and most of my generation was subject to the draft. And I went back with some Americans who had fought there, and we went to the North Vietnam to a celebration of writers. And I was walking along with them, and I realized that we all had gray hair, and they probably thought I was a Vietnam nurse, because I was walking with all of these men. And we met a lot of soldiers from the other side, and they were all poets, and they all read poetry together. So this is a small poem about that. It's called Hue, which is a city in Vietnam. We went that evening by dragon boat down the Perfume River as far as the pagoda of the 3 golden Buddhas. Candle boats in water and flames in floating lanterns down the night lit for the lost. The soldiers are old now, decades from the battlefield. Pewter-haired, steel-haired, moons caught in the plumeria branch, metal still in the fields of rice. Bicycle chains no longer sing in the streets, nor is there the whir of storks' wings. But on the gray stone slabs of the 10,000 graves lie chrysanthemum. During the war, we severed all thoughts of time. For us, it was as if time were all at once. Now we say greater courage is needed after the war than in its midst. We are clouds that pass and pass. What does it matter if we are not the same as clouds? We are flutes in a field waiting for breath. This is called Harmala P, and Harmala P is a Greek word meaning beautiful sadness. There are lots of languages where you have this word where it's a sadness, but it's one that you want to experience. Maybe it's the sadness of loving mourning, but it's not something you want to get away from. If anybody knows the English word for that, let me know, because I would like to know that. Harmala P. It's just a little poem. Don't ask me what it means. It begins with a word as small as the cry of Athena's owl. An ache in the cage of breath, as when we say, can hardly breathe. In sleep, we see our name on a stone, for instance. Or while walking in the rain among graves, we feel watched. Others are still coming into our lives. They come, they go out. Some speak quietly beside us on a bench near where koi swim. At night, there is a light sound of wings brushing the walls. Not now is what it sounds like. Or 2 other words. But they are the same passerines as live in the stone eaves, as forage in the air toward night. To see them, one must not be looking. Morning on the island. This is an actual island in the Pacific Northwest, where I go to write sometimes, if I'm lucky. The lights across the water are the waking city. The water shimmers with imaginary fish. Not far from here lie the bones of conifers, washed from the sea and piled by wind. Some mornings I walk upon them bone to bone as far as the lighthouse. A strange beetle has eaten most of the trees. It may have come here on the ships playing music in the harbor, or it was always here, a winged jewel, but in the past was kept still by the cold of a winter that no longer comes. There is an owl living in the firs behind us, but he is white, meant to be mistaken for snow, burdening a bough. They say he is the only owl remaining. I hear him at night, listening for the last of the mice, and asking who of no other owl. Resurrection for the poet Ingeborg Bachmann. Reading the last paragraphs of their lives, where they lived, how they came to the end. As with fallen snow in late spring, or as before dark the black clouds drift in a cloudless sky. In the folds below the snow, elk graze the remnants of an August fire in dread weather. Small white-breasted birds dip like swallows and go pine to pine. so her life after her death. The brave know they will not rise again, that no flesh will grow about them at judgment morning, that nothing of this is waiting. I am not brave. We have only to remember one piece of what we saw, and all will come back. So I think I give you two more poems to close, and then we can have some questions. This is a short one, and the woman in the poem is my grandmother, Anna, who died in 1968, but she wants to be in every poetry book. So I always have to do a poem for her. She kind of comes when I'm writing at night, and I kind of hear this little voice inside myself, I want to be in the book. So she gets to be in the book. This is called Sanctuary. Light peeled bell-like through the canopy, long ago or seems so. Then the ghost of a deer and crows flapping through smoke. She made a poultice for me of herbs and mud to suck the poison from the boil. And then she went into a mahogany coffin, as there were then. Morning's horses cantered through ground fog, having broken loose. So I would go out for them, bridles in hand, with no one awake. The closer I came to them, the further they moved away. Following them through the clouds is a journey I would make again. And lastly, I got, this is for all of you, any of you, who lived through a diagnosis of cancer and went through all of that they do and are still here. The process started for me in 2006, and this is the poem that came of it. It's what I think now. And it begins with a little epigraph by the French poet René Char, and the epigraph is something like, I carried from despair, let's see. I carried my despair in a basket, my love that was so light it could have been woven of willow. It's hard to translate on a stage, yeah. Okay, What Comes is the title. To speak is not yet to have spoken, the not yet of a white realm of nothing left, neither for itself nor another, a no longer already there, along with the arrival of what has been, light and the reverse of light, terror as walking blind along the breaking sea, body in whom I lived. The not yet of death, darkening what it briefly illuminates, an unknown place, as between languages, back and forth, breath to breath. A calm in the surround rises, fireflies in lindens, an ache of pine. You have yourself within you. Yourself. You have her. And there is nothing that cannot be seen. Open yourself then to the coming of what comes. Thank you. Thank you. I hope that's right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you have any? Oh, this is such an intimate setting. We have a few minutes for questions, and then we can go out and talk one-on-one and over in a reception. And there's a microphone. We're going to play Oprah, I think. So you'll have your own microphone to ask your question if you want to ask one. I don't have any prizes to give out. But it doesn't matter, and please keep changing the subject if you like. It can be about poetry or anything. There's someone down in the front here.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I didn't know when the hand raising was supposed to start, so I apologize if I jumped any of you. My question is about your poem, The Colonel, and I was just wondering, how did he know that you were a poet?
Oh, that's how I always identified myself, because it had the advantage of being true, you know? Mm-hmm. So if he looked it up, which he wouldn't do, he would find out that I was indeed a poet. He didn't think that's all I was, though. Apparently, poet is a suspicious-sounding thing to be if you're from the United States. But we talked about poetry, you know, and talk about this and that before everything sort of turned out like that, right? So I was actually a poet on a Guggenheim grant when I was there, and I was hoping to translate poetry, improve my Spanish, and things like that. I didn't really go there to do what I wound up doing, but events overtook me, and that's what happened. So that was really my identity, which again had the advantage of being true, yeah. You know what he said to me once? He said, "Sure, and I am also a poet." Just like Ellie in the hospital. You know, I too write poetry. I thought, okay, I bet, you know, yeah.
Maybe a different kind of poetry.
Yeah, I guess so. Who else says someone else? You don't have to be shy. You have the most beautiful campus in the world. You know that, right? I was just kind of stunned by it. Everyone tells me it's showing off right now, but it's quite lovely. Yes, in there. Okay.
Try to speak into the microphone. In several of the works you have, you're focusing on the people who have, who have died in your life. And I was wondering what the experience is like when you're writing about people who've passed on.
You know, it's funny because you really want to write a poem for all of them. But when you sit down to write, you never know what's going to happen. So some of them got poems and some of them didn't. I think what happens is I start off writing about something else. I try not to be too elegiac a poet, but it hasn't turned out well with this book. I start writing about something else and then they'll come into my mind and I start to make them come back, you know? And so that's what happens. And I'm hoping to grow out of this, you know, into a more joyous sort of period of my life. But, you know, you go through parts of your life that are, this is what's overtaken me now, is this elegiac mode, you know. So when people ask me what kind of poetry I write, which is a question they ask, you know, what kind of poetry do you write? I can say elegiac poetry. Okay. He's got the torch. Who else wants to ask something? I got lots of questions today in the classes. Yes, back there in the middle. You just pass it up that way. Tyrone will take it, or someone, right? Yeah. See, I know names now. I know people here. Okay.
Okay. Since you write a lot about the people who have passed in your life, do you ever start writing and not think of them, or do you always sometimes start a poem for them? Or?
Well, Ilya's alive, you know.
Yes.
And I wrote.
I was not saying
and
everyone's
there
dead.
are people who are alive, you know. But no, right. It's just that when you sit down to write a poem, you're in a state of meditative expectancy. You don't know what's going to happen. And you're in that state every day. If you're lucky, you have a moment to go to the page. And usually starts with an image or something, very small, some little thing. The thing that happened with that poem, I didn't really think about Ilya or Galileo or anything. I remembered looking out the window, watching the snow fall on the minaret. And when it hit the minaret, it disappeared. You know, so I just went back. You go back to a moment and you see something. Now, Michael Ondaatje, who's a wonderful Canadian novelist, he wrote The English Patient. He said, I get an image, and then I ask it a question. And then I get another image and I ask another question. You can write a whole novel like that. He said, I can't write a whole novel like that, but he can. So there's a kind of process that goes on. It's meditative and it goes back and forth being conscious. You know, you sort of surface while you're writing and you say, oh, you know, look at that. I can do this with it, or I can turn in this direction or that direction. And so, what was the question? It was, do I ever... She doesn't remember either, so, okay. I thought I answered it, though, did I? Anybody? I'll ask the audience, okay? I'm going to use up one of my, phone a friend. Did I answer the question? Okay. What else? Uh-huh. Oh,
based on what you were just saying, sorry, you know, I was thinking a little bit about Robert Olin Butler's book, From Where We Dream.
uh-huh.
And I'm wondering if you could give us any advice about how, when one enters that meditative state, right, and you write a poem, you write a story, you write an essay, but then you have to surface, right?
Yeah.
And you have to make dinner, go about your business. But then that piece of work needs to be revised.
Right.
So do you do anything in particular to get back into that same place, the same voice, the same goal?
I try not to revise immediately. I try to put it away a little bit so I can get some distance on it. I think when in the revision process is a different process entirely. It's also an art. It's an art of choosing and an art of erasing and an art of adding and mostly paring down for me. That's when your knowledge of craft comes into play. That's when that gets important. That's when you use that. And your critical sensibility that's been developed in all of those workshops and classes. And that's when all of your reading comes in handy. You've read deeply in your genre, deeply and widely, and you have all those tutors in your head of the past works. So you've got all of that, and you go to a different place, which is, let's look at this. You know, let me try it again, or let me wander around with a pen inside of it and see if I can compress it or make it more interesting or rearrange it in a more interesting way. Is my syntax repetitive? And you ask very mundane questions, you know, and you try to get to the essence of it. I revise endlessly. I can revise a poem 60 or 70 times. Why? Partly, I think I'm making it better, which I often am not. You get to a certain point, you start destroying it. I could erase every word until there's nothing left. I could do that. But it's also because then you don't have to write a new poem, you know, because you're working on something. You're revising something. New poems are terrifying. You know, the blank page is terrifying. At least with a revision, you've got work to do, and you've got something to work with, you know. That's especially true, I've heard, in book-length prose works. You've got something to work with. Once you've got a first draft out, you are actually writing a novel. Before the first draft, you don't have anything yet. So, or so Margaret Atwood said. So she told me, get to the end, stop making the sentences over and over. It's not about the sentences, it's about, you know, the through line, the narrative, get to the end, and then you can work on it. There's a whole other art, and that's what you can learn, really, in your classes. That's what I learned from other writers. They say writing can't be taught. Oh, yes, it can. You can't teach someone to get into that state and dream on paper, as Marilyn Robinson calls it. But you can learn to make it better on paper. You can learn that. So there are skills involved, yeah. I mean, now, getting back, before you go to the end, before you abandon the story or the poem, you have to see whether it recreates in you the feeling it arose from, whether it can take you all the way back to where it was born. And if you haven't destroyed it by erasing too much, it will take you back there. And if it takes you back there, it just might take another reader back there. You know, what you're trying to do is, you're not trying to write about rain, you're trying to make it rain in another person, you know, something like that. I know I'm misquoting that, but something like that. So that's what we're trying to do. We're we're bringing someone else into that state. And what does that do? It helps us to live within the sensibility of another. And what does that do? It increases our capacity for empathy, and it increases our empathic imagination. And what does that do? It makes us deeper human beings. So it's really, really important. So we can't be cutting the humanities and the arts and writing or thinking that they're just window dressing or superfluous. Boy, I shouldn't get into that speech. I'm in kind of an ideal place here, right? I understand that, Hendrix. You know, this is an amazing place, and I really, let's go to the reception. I'm very impressed. Thank you.